On a crowded morning in the heart of Manhattan, inside a coffee shop lined with marble counters and soft golden light, everyone seemed to bow before wealth without even realizing it. Voices lowered when certain names were mentioned. Chairs were offered before they were asked for. Every gesture in that room seemed to orbit around status, except for one ordinary man standing quietly near the window. When a woman dressed in plain clothes was mocked by a group of wealthy patrons and pressured to leave simply because she did not look like she belonged, nobody dared to speak up. Nobody, except Daniel Carter. He had no idea who she really was. He had no idea that within a few short minutes, one small act of decency would quietly rewrite the rest of his life, and would one day be spoken about inside the walls of a corporation worth tens of billions of dollars. Daniel Carter was 38 years old, and if a stranger passed him on the street, they would notice nothing extraordinary about him. He worked as an independent industrial maintenance engineer, the kind of profession that never appeared in glossy magazines, yet quietly kept entire systems of machinery, energy, and logistics from collapsing. He understood turbines the way some men understood chess, and he could diagnose a failing conveyor system just by listening to the rhythm of its motor. His income was solid but unremarkable, enough to keep a small apartment clean and his refrigerator stocked. Never enough to draw attention. More than once, he had walked away from lucrative contracts the moment he sensed something dishonest beneath the surface. Decisions that cost him money but never cost him sleep. He lived alone in a modest apartment on the edge of Queens, the kind of home where everything had its place, where the sheets were always folded with the same crisp corner, where his shoes were lined up like soldiers by the door. He woke at the same hour every single day, arrived everywhere 5 minutes early, and treated punctuality as a form of respect rather than a habit. Daniel believed, quietly and without needing anyone to agree with him, that honor was worth more than money, that a man's word meant nothing if it bent, depending on who was listening. The owner of the coffee shop, a soft-spoken woman named Carol, knew him by name and by order. A plain black coffee, no sugar, no performance. He always thanked the staff, always remembered their names, and never once mentioned his own accomplishments, because in his mind, there was nothing to boast about in simply doing the right thing. There was a quiet moment weeks earlier, sitting across from a young apprentice who had asked him why he never took shortcuts even when nobody was watching. Daniel had looked up from his coffee, thought for a moment, and answered in the calm, unhurried tone that defined him. "You cannot control how other people choose to behave," he said, "but you can always control how you choose to respond." The apprentice had laughed it off as something out of a motivational poster, but Daniel meant every word of it. And that single sentence would echo far beyond that conversation, shaping a decision he had not yet known he would make. There was a rhythm to his days that most people would have found dull, yet Daniel found comfort in it. The same walk to the same subway platform, the same nod to the newspaper vendor on the corner, the same 15 minutes spent reading before bed. He was not a man chasing excitement, and he never mistook stillness for a lack of ambition. He simply believed that a life built carefully, brick by brick, on honesty and discipline, was worth more than a life built quickly on shortcuts he would later regret. Friends were few, but the ones he kept were kept for years, sometimes decades, the kind of loyalty that could not be bought or manufactured overnight. When people asked why he never seemed to want more than what he already had, he would simply shrug and say that wanting more was not the same as needing more. The morning of the incident, the coffee shop was busier than usual, filled with the low hum of laptops, clinking porcelain, and half-finished business calls. A woman walked in wearing a plain gray sweater, worn denim jeans, and an old leather bag with a frayed strap. Her presence unremarkable in every visible way. She ordered quietly, found a small table near the back, and opened a notebook, as if she simply wanted a place to think. It did not take long before a group of wealthy patrons near the counter noticed her, their voices rising just enough to be heard, laced with amusement dressed up as concern. They whispered that she did not belong in a place like this, that someone dressed the way she was dressed should not be occupying a table meant for people who mattered. One woman among them, dripping in designer fabric and irritation, decided to make her point more directly. She approached the counter, ordered a drink she never intended to keep, and let it spill deliberately onto the floor near the woman in gray. Immediately turning to blame her for the mess, the staff hesitated, unsure how to intervene, and the rest of the room simply watched, phones lowered just enough to see without seeming to care. Nobody moved to help. Nobody wanted to be the one to challenge people who clearly believed their money gave them permission to behave however they pleased. Cups clinked in the background. A barista called out an order that no one collected, and the low murmur of conversation seemed to grow quieter and quieter, as if the entire room had chosen to look away at the same time. The woman in gray said nothing, gathering her things with quiet dignity, prepared to simply leave rather than cause a scene, her jaw set in the practiced calm of someone who had learned long ago not to give strangers the satisfaction of a reaction. That was when Daniel stood up. He did not raise his voice. He did not point fingers or trade insults, because that was never his way of proving a point. He simply walked forward, positioned himself calmly between the group and the woman they were tormenting, and spoke in a tone so level it made the noise around him seem foolish by comparison. "If status is what decides how we treat another human being," he said, "then the shame in this room does not belong to her clothing. It belongs to whoever thought clothing was a measure of worth in the first place." The room fell into an uncomfortable silence, the kind that made people suddenly very interested in their coffee cups. The group, caught between embarrassment and pride, muttered a few half-hearted remarks before gathering their things and walking out, unwilling to argue further in front of an audience that was clearly no longer on their side. The woman in gray turned to Daniel, her eyes steady despite the tension that had just passed, and thanked him quietly. The kind of gratitude that did not need many words to be sincere. Daniel simply smiled, brushing it off the way he brushed off most things that made him uncomfortable being noticed for. "That is just something anyone should have done," he said, before returning to his table, as if nothing extraordinary had happened at all. But something extraordinary had happened, and though neither of them fully understood it yet, that moment would not be forgotten. Carol, watching quietly from behind the counter, wiped down a nearby table just to have a reason to linger close enough to hear the last of it, a faint smile tugging at the corner of her mouth. She had seen Daniel 100 mornings before this one. Always polite. Always unremarkable in the way that decent people often are, and something about watching him stand so calmly against a room full of arrogance made her feel, for reasons she could not quite explain, that she had witnessed something rare. The woman in gray gathered her notebook, offered Carol a small nod of thanks on her way out, and disappeared into the crowded sidewalk outside, leaving behind no name, no explanation, and no indication of the storm of consequence that single morning would eventually set into motion. What Daniel did not know, and what no one else in that coffee shop suspected, was that the woman in gray was Sophia Bennett. She was 35 years old, and she stood at the head of Bennett Capital, an investment conglomerate whose holdings stretched across continents, industries, and balance sheets worth tens of billions of dollars. Several times a month, she deliberately dressed down, stepped away from the glass towers and boardrooms that defined her public life, and disappeared into the ordinary world as someone entirely unremarkable. It was not a performance for attention, since no one ever knew who she truly was during those hours. It was, instead, the only way she had found to observe people honestly, to see how they behaved when they believed no reward or punishment was watching them. She stepped outside the coffee shop and walked calmly toward a black car waiting at the curb, where her assistant, a sharp and observant woman named Olivia Grant, held the door open without asking a single question, having long grown used to these unannounced disappearances. Sophia settled into the seat, her expression unreadable to anyone who did not know her well, though something in her eyes had shifted since the morning began. Finally, she said quietly, almost to herself, someone who did not measure a person's value by the watch on their wrist. Olivia glanced at her through the mirror, sensing there was more to the sentence than its surface suggested, though she said nothing and simply waited. Sophia had built her disguise routine years earlier, long before Bennett Capital had grown into the empire it was now, back when she still remembered what it felt like to be judged by something other than her balance sheet. It had started almost by accident. A cancelled meeting, an unplanned afternoon, a plain coat pulled from the back of her closet, and within an hour she had discovered something she never expected, that people spoke to her differently when they believed she had nothing to offer them. Some were kind without condition, offering directions or a seat without needing anything in return, and those moments had stayed with her far longer than any successful acquisition ever had. Others revealed a colder version of themselves, dismissive, impatient, sometimes outright cruel, and those moments taught her just as much about the people she worked alongside every single day. Sophia did not ask to meet Daniel. She did not send a message, a gift, or any gesture that might reveal what had just happened inside that coffee shop. Instead, she gave Olivia a single instruction, delivered with the same calm precision she used when authorizing a merger worth hundreds of millions of dollars. "Find out who he is," she said. "Learn everything about him, but do not approach him, and do not let him know he is being watched." It was not suspicion that drove her request, but curiosity, the rare kind that only appears when someone behaves in a way that defies every pattern she had learned to expect from people. Within days, a small and quiet team began assembling a portrait of Daniel Carter. The kind of investigation usually reserved for high-level hires or potential business partners, not for a stranger who had simply stood up in a coffee shop. What they found was almost disappointing in its simplicity. There were no scandals buried in his past, no unpaid debts trailing behind him, no lawsuits, no public feuds, not even the faintest presence on social media, where most people, at least occasionally, performed a version of themselves. He was, by every measurable standard, an unremarkable man living an honest, quiet life, which made him more remarkable than almost anyone else they had ever investigated. Olivia compiled the findings into a slim folder, far thinner than the files usually prepared for candidates being considered for positions of influence within the company. There were no headlines to reference, no glowing testimonials from powerful acquaintances, no evidence of the networking most executives relied upon to climb higher than their talent alone might carry them. Instead, there were small, quiet details. A landlord who described him as the easiest tenant she had ever had, a former coworker who mentioned he once gave up his own bonus so a struggling colleague could keep their job, a neighbor who recalled him shoveling snow from an elderly widow's driveway every winter without ever being asked. None of it read like the resume of someone destined for boardrooms, and yet all of it read like the resume of someone who could be trusted completely, which, to Sophia, mattered far more. One detail, however, stood apart from the rest of the file, a moment from 5 years earlier that had nearly vanished into obscurity. Daniel had been working as a site engineer for a mid-sized construction firm when he uncovered evidence of deliberate fraud, cut corners in structural reinforcement that could have endangered hundreds of future occupants if left unreported. He was quietly offered a significant sum, roughly $500,000, to remain silent and let the project proceed unchecked. Daniel refused without hesitation, reported the fraud through every proper channel available to him, and within weeks found himself unemployed, quietly pushed out by people who had far more power than he did. From that point forward, he built a modest freelance career, never speaking of the incident, never using it to gain sympathy or credibility, simply carrying it as a private truth about who he was. Sophia read that section of the report twice, her expression unreadable to the small circle of advisors seated around her. One of them, a longtime board member with decades of experience judging talent, finally broke the silence in the room. "This man is too honest to survive in business," he said, half amused, half genuinely concerned. Sophia looked up from the file, her voice calm but unmistakably certain. "That," she said, "is exactly why I need him." The email that arrived in Daniel's inbox a week later seemed almost like a mistake. A formal invitation from Bennett Capital, requesting his presence at their corporate headquarters. He assumed, quite reasonably, that someone had confused his name with another contractor's, since nothing in his ordinary life connected him to a company of that scale. Still, curiosity and a faint sense of obligation pulled him toward the appointment, and on the designated morning, he found himself standing outside a towering glass building that seemed to swallow the sky above it. The lobby alone felt larger than his entire apartment building, Polished stone floors reflecting light from every direction. Security guards speaking in hushed, efficient tones. He was led through a series of elevators and hallways until he reached a private office on one of the highest floors, where the woman waiting for him stood in stark contrast to the person he remembered from the coffee shop. Sophia Bennett stood dressed in the sharp, tailored authority of a chief executive, her posture commanding the room in a way that made Daniel pause mid-step, momentarily uncertain whether he had walked into the wrong meeting entirely. Recognition arrived slowly, then, all at once, as her features aligned with the memory of the woman in the gray sweater from days earlier. Daniel stood frozen for a moment, processing the sheer distance between who he thought he had helped and who was actually standing in front of him now. Sophia explained everything calmly, walking him through the purpose of her disguises, the reason she disappeared into ordinary spaces several times a month, and the reason his name had ended up on her desk. "I did not invite you here because you helped me," she said, her tone steady and deliberate. "I invited you here because you are going to help my company." Daniel listened in silence, still adjusting to the scale of what was unfolding around him, uncertain how a maintenance engineer from Queens could possibly be useful to an empire of this size. He glanced around the office as she spoke, taking in the floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city he had lived in his entire life, yet had never once seen from this height. The framed degrees on the wall, the quiet hum of a building, designed to intimidate anyone who was not accustomed to it. Everything about the room seemed to whisper a language he did not speak fluently. A language built on leverage, projection, and calculated confidence, and for a brief moment he wondered whether he had wandered too far from the world he understood. Yet when he looked back at Sophia, he saw something familiar beneath the tailored suit and polished composure, the same steady eyes that had thanked him quietly in a crowded coffee shop just days before, and that familiarity was enough to keep him from walking straight back out the door. She offered him a position unlike anything he had ever imagined for himself, an operational advisory role focused on identifying inefficiencies, weaknesses, and blind spots across her company's vast industrial and logistical operations. Daniel hesitated, not out of fear, but out of a lifelong instinct to avoid situations that felt too convenient, too sudden, too far removed from the steady rhythm he had built his life around. Sophia did not pressure him, did not attempt to persuade him with numbers or promises, simply allowing the offer to sit in the space between them. After several long moments of silence, Daniel finally agreed. Though something in his expression suggested he already sensed this decision would test him in ways he could not yet predict, his arrival inside Bennett Capital was met with far less enthusiasm than Sophia's confidence in him. Several senior executives questioned the decision openly in meetings, unable to understand why a chief executive would elevate an outside maintenance contractor into a role with access to sensitive operational data. Whispers followed him through hallways, dismissive comments, disguised as jokes, the kind of condescension reserved for people assumed to be temporary distractions rather than genuine additions to the company. "What does a maintenance engineer know about running a corporation?" one executive muttered just loud enough for others to hear and laugh along with. Among the skeptics, one figure stood apart in both influence and hostility. A sharply dressed chief operating officer named Richard Hale, whose polished manners barely concealed his contempt for Daniel's presence. Richard had spent nearly 15 years climbing toward his position, carefully managing perceptions, relationships, and information in ways that had made him nearly untouchable within the company's hierarchy. He viewed Daniel not merely as an inconvenience, but as a direct threat to the careful architecture of control he had built over the years, someone whose blunt honesty might expose things Richard preferred to remain hidden. Richard began quietly working against Daniel in ways subtle enough to avoid suspicion, assigning him deliberately difficult projects, withholding critical data under the excuse of confidentiality protocols, and ensuring meetings conveniently excluded him whenever anything important was discussed. Daniel noticed the pattern almost immediately. Yet he never confronted Richard directly, never complained to Sophia, never sought sympathy from colleagues who might have understood his frustration. Instead, he did what he had always done throughout his life, quietly absorbing the difficulty and working twice as hard in silence, trusting that competence would eventually speak louder than politics ever could. Richard's contempt was never loud enough to be reported, never crude enough to be documented, which made it far more dangerous than open hostility would have been. He was a master of the small cut. The meeting scheduled at the exact moment Daniel had a prior commitment. The report handed over an hour before it was due. The compliment delivered with just enough sarcasm to sting, without ever crossing into something Daniel could formally challenge. Some evenings, walking home through the same familiar streets that had once felt entirely ordinary, Daniel allowed himself a rare moment of doubt, wondering whether he had made a mistake leaving behind the simple, honest work he understood for a world that seemed built on games he had never learned to play. He never voiced that doubt to anyone, not even to himself for very long, choosing instead to return the next morning exactly on time, exactly as prepared, exactly as unwilling to be pushed out as he had been the day before. Word of his quiet persistence slowly moved through the company, and skepticism gradually softened into cautious curiosity, especially among the ranks of employees who had spent years enduring Richard's condescension themselves. Still, nobody expected Daniel's turning point to arrive as suddenly or as dramatically as it eventually did, and even Sophia, watching from a careful distance, wondered how long it would take before someone gave him the opportunity to prove exactly what he was capable of. That opportunity arrived without warning, when Bennett Capital's primary logistics network suffered a catastrophic breakdown affecting warehouses, shipping routes, and automated systems across 3 separate states. The financial damage climbed into the millions of dollars for every single day the failure continued unresolved, threatening contracts, partnerships, and the confidence of investors who did not tolerate instability well. A team of highly credentialed engineers and analysts worked around the clock for nearly 2 full days, running diagnostics, rewriting code, and testing hardware. Yet the root cause remained frustratingly invisible. Daniel requested 2 hours alone with the system, a request that drew skeptical glances from engineers who had already exhausted resources far beyond what he had access to. Rather than sitting behind a screen analyzing reports from a distance, he walked directly into the physical facility, moving between servers, control panels, and mechanical junctions with the same quiet focus he once brought to construction sites years earlier. He listened to the machinery the way most engineers listened only to data, running his hands along connections, checking timing sequences manually rather than relying entirely on software readouts. Buried within the layers of automated synchronization, he discovered an almost imperceptible timing discrepancy, a fraction of a second misalignment between 2 subsystems that had gone unnoticed by every diagnostic tool designed to catch far larger errors. It was the kind of flaw that software often overlooked precisely because it was too small, too human, too dependent on physical intuition, rather than algorithmic pattern recognition. Within a matter of hours, Daniel corrected the synchronization manually, recalibrated the affected systems, and watched as the entire logistics network slowly hummed back to life across every affected facility. Engineers who had spent 2 sleepless days buried in code gathered around the monitors as the numbers finally began climbing back toward normal. Some of them too exhausted to fully process what had just happened, others watching Daniel with the cautious curiosity of people forced to reconsider an assumption they had held without question. One young analyst, barely a year into her career, asked him quietly how he had known where to look when the diagnostics had found nothing at all. Daniel considered the question for a moment before answering. "Machines rarely lie," he said. "But they do not always speak in numbers. Sometimes you have to listen to them the way you would listen to a person who is struggling to explain what is wrong." It was not the kind of answer that fit neatly into a training manual. Yet it was the kind of answer that stayed with everyone who heard it. The relief inside the company was immediate and overwhelming. Executives who had spent 2 sleepless days bracing for disaster, suddenly finding themselves staring at restored operations they had assumed were still weeks away from resolution. For the first time since his arrival, employees began looking at Daniel differently, not as an outsider tolerated because of the chief executive's favor, but as someone whose quiet competence had just saved the company from a devastating financial blow. Even those who had mocked him weeks earlier found themselves reluctantly impressed, though few were willing to admit it openly just yet. Just as the company began settling into a fragile sense of stability, a far greater crisis emerged. One with consequences reaching well beyond a single logistics failure. Bennett Capital stood on the verge of finalizing a multi-billion-dollar acquisition deal, a partnership that depended entirely on flawless operational performance during a critical evaluation period demanded by the opposing company's board. Any visible instability during those final weeks threatened to collapse the deal entirely, sending shockwaves through the stock market and eroding investor confidence built over years of careful strategy. The opposing company's board had made their conditions clear from the very first negotiation, demanding flawless performance metrics across every division before they would agree to finalize terms that had already taken nearly 18 months to negotiate. Sophia had staked considerable personal credibility on the deal, publicly assuring shareholders that Bennett Capital's operations were as stable and resilient as any in the industry, a claim that now hung dangerously close to being disproven at the worst possible moment. Every failed shipment, every delayed report, every unexplained system error chipped away at the narrative she had spent months constructing, and she understood better than anyone how quickly confidence, once broken, became almost impossible to fully rebuild. Daniel, reviewing operational logs late one evening, noticed patterns that did not resemble the natural chaos of technical failure. Small inconsistencies too deliberate, too precisely timed to be accidental. What looked to others like ordinary system stress revealed itself to him as something far more troubling. A carefully disguised pattern of sabotage, designed to trigger failures at the worst possible moments. Someone inside the company, someone with detailed access to sensitive systems, was intentionally working to derail the acquisition from within. He brought his suspicions directly to Sophia rather than raising alarms publicly, understanding instinctively that premature exposure could cause as much damage as the sabotage itself. Together, they moved carefully and quietly, cross-referencing access logs, timestamps, and internal communications, slowly narrowing the list of possible suspects down through methodical, patient investigation. Every piece of evidence they uncovered pointed with increasing certainty toward one familiar name, a name neither of them found particularly surprising once the truth began taking shape. Late one night, reviewing footage from a server room access log, Sophia sat across from Daniel in a quiet office lit only by the glow of two monitors, the rest of the building long since emptied for the evening. She asked him, almost absently, whether he had suspected Richard from the very beginning, back when the hostility had first started. Daniel shook his head slowly, admitting that he had assumed it was simple pride. A man unwilling to share credit, rather than something deliberate enough to risk an entire company's future. "It is strange," he said, "how the people most desperate to protect their position are often the ones who end up destroying it themselves." Sophia said nothing for a long moment, watching him with an expression that had little to do with the crisis unfolding around them, before quietly returning her attention to the files spread across the desk between them. During an emergency board meeting called to address the mounting operational concerns, Daniel stood before the company's most senior leadership and calmly presented everything they had gathered: timelines, access records, and technical evidence laid out with the same measured precision he brought to every machine he had ever repaired. The room fell silent as the presentation reached its conclusion, revealing Richard Hale as the source of the sabotage, motivated by fear that Daniel's rising influence threatened the position he had spent years protecting. Richard's composed facade finally cracked under the weight of undeniable evidence, and within days, his termination was finalized. His once untouchable status dissolving into quiet disgrace. For employees who had endured years of his quiet cruelty, the outcome delivered a sense of justice long overdue. A reminder that manipulation, however carefully disguised, eventually collapses beneath the truth. Sophia watched Daniel throughout the meeting with an expression of quiet admiration, recognizing that his integrity had not only saved the company from operational disaster, but had also exposed a corruption that had been quietly poisoning it from within for years. Not long afterward, during a major industry conference filled with journalists, investors, and business leaders from across the country, Sophia made a decision that surprised even her closest advisors. Standing before the audience, she chose to reveal the full story behind her disguise. The coffee shop, the humiliation she endured, and the ordinary man who chose decency when no one else would. She played the security footage captured that morning, allowing the room to witness firsthand the moment Daniel stood up for a stranger without any knowledge of who she truly was. The footage spread rapidly once journalists began reporting on it, transforming a quiet, personal moment into a story that captured public attention across news outlets and business publications alike. Several of the wealthy patrons who had mocked Sophia that morning found themselves identified, criticized, and in some cases professionally embarrassed once their behavior became public knowledge. A few faced canceled business relationships, their reputations suddenly vulnerable in ways they had never anticipated when they believed status alone protected them. Others issued public apologies, though many of those apologies rang hollow against the backdrop of what had already been exposed. For weeks afterward, the story continued circulating through business circles and dinner conversations alike, discussed not merely as gossip, but as something closer to a parable, a reminder that wealth had never guaranteed character, and never would. Analysts wrote columns about corporate culture and hidden bias. Professors referenced the incident in lectures about leadership and integrity. And strangers who had never set foot inside that coffee shop found themselves, for reasons they could not fully articulate, moved by the simplicity of what Daniel had done. He received offers, invitations, and requests for interviews that stretched far beyond anything Bennett Capital could have anticipated, nearly all of which he politely declined, preferring instead to let the story speak for itself, rather than turning it into a performance built around his own image. Reporters eventually sought Daniel directly, hoping to capture a triumphant statement befitting the story unfolding around him, yet he offered nothing resembling self-congratulation. "I did not help a billionaire," he said simply, his voice steady despite the cameras and microphones surrounding him. "I helped a person who was being treated unfairly." That single sentence traveled further than almost anything else said throughout the entire event, resonating with people who recognized something rare in its quiet sincerity. In the months that followed, Daniel's role within Bennett Capital evolved naturally, not through favoritism or gratitude, but through consistent demonstration of skill, insight, and integrity that even his harshest critics could no longer deny. He was formally appointed Director of Operational Strategy, a position earned entirely through merit, built upon the same quiet diligence that had defined every chapter of his life before that fateful morning in the coffee shop. Sophia's confidence in him deepened steadily, not as sudden admiration, but as the slow, earned trust that comes from watching someone prove themselves again and again under pressure. Their working relationship gradually transformed into something neither of them rushed to define too quickly, built on mutual respect rather than the performative romance often expected in stories like theirs. They understood one another in ways few people around them could fully grasp. Two individuals who had each learned, in very different circumstances, the cost of trusting the wrong people. Conversations that once revolved strictly around company strategy slowly expanded into quieter, more personal territory, shared over long evenings analyzing reports that no longer felt entirely like work. Neither of them treated the growing connection between them as inevitable or dramatic, allowing it instead to develop at its own unhurried pace. Without the urgency so often mistaken for genuine affection, there were no grand declarations, no sudden confessions delivered beneath dramatic lighting, only steady presence, consistent honesty, and the quiet comfort of two people who had learned to trust each other through actions rather than words. It was, in its own understated way, more meaningful than anything either of them had previously experienced. There was an evening, some months into their partnership, when Sophia stayed unusually late at the office, long after the rest of the floor had gone dark, working through a proposal that had left her more frustrated than she cared to admit. Daniel found her still at her desk, papers scattered in a rare display of disorder. And instead of offering advice or opinions on the numbers in front of her, he simply made 2 cups of coffee from the small machine in the break room and set one quietly beside her hand. She looked up, surprised less by the gesture itself than by how unremarkable he made it seem. As though caring for another person required no announcement at all. They talked for over an hour that night, not about the proposal, but about childhood, about the father who had taught Daniel the value of a job done properly, about the mother who had taught Sophia that money without purpose was simply another kind of poverty. Neither of them realized, until much later, that this quiet, unplanned evening had done more to bring them together than any of the carefully orchestrated moments that followed it. Almost exactly 1 year after the coffee shop incident that started everything, Sophia introduced a company-wide initiative that reshaped how Bennett Capital approached hiring, promotion, and evaluation across every level of its organization. Rather than measuring potential through pedigree, background, or polished credentials, the new framework prioritized character, integrity, and demonstrated competence above all else. Daniel became one of the central architects behind this cultural transformation, shaping training programs and evaluation standards designed to ensure that no talented, honest employee would ever again be overlooked simply because of appearances. The initiative attracted significant attention across the industry, praised by analysts and employees alike as a rare example of genuine structural change rather than empty corporate messaging. Daniel found himself, almost accidentally, becoming the very embodiment of the values the company now claimed to represent. A living reminder that decency and competence were never mutually exclusive. He remained, through all of it, remarkably unchanged in temperament, still arriving early to every meeting, still treating every employee with the same quiet respect he had shown long before anyone knew his name. Younger employees began seeking him out for advice, not because his title demanded it, but because something about the steadiness in his voice made people trust his judgment more than they trusted the polished confidence of executives who had spent their careers performing certainty rather than earning it. He never postured, never dressed up simple truths in complicated language, and never pretended to know more than he actually did, which made his rare moments of confidence carry far more weight than they otherwise would have. A junior employee once asked him what the secret was to rising as far as he had risen in so short a time, and Daniel simply laughed, telling her there was no secret at all, only the discipline of doing the right thing consistently, especially on the days when nobody was watching to notice. One late afternoon, nearly identical in weather and atmosphere to the morning that had changed everything, Daniel and Sophia returned to the very coffee shop where their story had first begun. They chose the same worn wooden table near the window, the same seats, the same quiet corner that had once witnessed an act of kindness neither of them fully understood the weight of at the time. Carol, the shop owner who had known Daniel long before any of this unfolded, froze mid-step as recognition slowly dawned across her face, realizing exactly who was sitting across from him now. Whispers rippled quietly through the room as other customers gradually pieced together who the woman beside Daniel truly was. The same disbelief and curiosity that had once filled headlines now filling the small, familiar space around them. A young barista, new enough to the shop that she had never heard the story firsthand, glanced nervously toward Carol as if seeking permission to approach the table, only to be waved off gently with a knowing smile. Carol had watched this story unfold from the very beginning, long before it belonged to newspapers or television segments, and she understood better than anyone that some moments deserved to remain exactly as ordinary as they had started. She brought over 2 coffees without being asked, black, no sugar, exactly the way Daniel always ordered, setting them down with the same quiet familiarity as she had 100 mornings before this one, as though nothing about the 2 people sitting at that table had changed at all. Daniel, entirely unbothered by the attention, simply smiled and returned his focus to the woman across the table, unwilling to let the moment be defined by anyone else's astonishment. Sophia studied him for a long moment, something thoughtful and unguarded passing across her expression before she finally spoke the question that had quietly lingered between them for a year. "Do you ever regret standing up that day?" she asked softly, her voice carrying none of the authority she wielded inside boardrooms, only genuine curiosity. Daniel turned his gaze toward the window, watching the ordinary rhythm of the city continue outside. People walking past entirely unaware of the story unfolding just beyond the glass. After a moment of quiet reflection, he answered with the same calm certainty that had defined every important decision of his life. "I would do it again," he said, "even if that day you had only ever been an ordinary person, exactly like everyone else in that room believed you were." Sophia's expression softened into something gentle and unmistakably sincere. A smile that belonged entirely to the private world they had built together. Far removed from headlines, boardrooms, or public perception, outside the window, the city continued exactly as it always had. Indifferent to the quiet significance of the moment unfolding inside that small, familiar coffee shop, and somewhere within that ordinary afternoon, an unspoken truth settled quietly between them, one worth carrying long after the conversation ended. Kindness was never meant to be an investment made in hope of future reward, a transaction calculated in advance for personal gain. Yet it was precisely because Daniel expected nothing in return that morning that his simple act became something far greater than either of them could have imagined. A quiet reminder that the truest value a person can hold has never depended on wealth, status, or recognition at all.